Crossfire.
Fantastic. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining. And let me just be the next person in line to say Happy National Cybersecurity Awareness Month. I hope everyone's having a good Cybersecurity Awareness Month. How many people didn't know it was National Cybersecurity Awareness Month? I think it's also National Squirrel Awareness Month. So I'm not sure if those two.
Celebrating.
Yeah, I'm sure Jericho will be happy. So on behalf of the Brent Scowcroft Center and my boss, Barry Pavel, our chairman, John Huntsman, and CEO of the Atlantic Council, Fred Kemp, I just want to thank everyone for joining for this discussion on cyber threats and what's the update and what are the larger trends. This is a relaunch of our Cyber Risk Wednesday series that we usually hold them every third Wednesday of the month because we're coming into November and December. They're going to be mixed up a little bit. But in general, we'll be doing these on Wednesday and then either wine or other kinds of snacks. We started these in partnership with Zurich Insurance. The next one is going to be November 5th, and that is going to be on NATO cyber issues, featuring Ambassador Soren De Caro, the Assistant Secretary General of Emerging Security Challenges, to talk about the Wales Summit and the advances that they've made in their enhanced cybersecurity initiatives for NATO. And then on December 10th, we'll be looking at embedded medical devices and the security around embedded medical devices. Just was hitting the headlines today. And that is, both of those events are going to be from 9 a.m. to 11 a.m. So we'll have breakfast for each of those. This event, it will take 90 minutes. We advertise till 5, but since we are going to have wine and cheese after this, we figure, we can start a half hour early for that. So it'll be 90 minutes. It will be on the record. I saw a lot of folks from the press here. So a lot of times when you're in National Cybersecurity Awareness Month or at cyber events in general, they become a topic about everything because we're still not really good about separating out the times we're going to be talking about one topic or another. Today, with the kind of people that we were able to get today, we really especially wanted to zoom in and spend probably about 70 to 80% of the time talking about the cyber threats. So I'd done a history book on cyber conflict last year, and we came across this great book, a great report that was done by the Defense Science Board, and it talked about how you have software leakage and hardware leakage, and it can be your computer might get modified at the factory, the maintenance man might be able to get access to it, all of these ways that people could get at your computer and get the information. And it seems very modern, but it was written in 1970. And so it really made us think, wow, maybe a lot of the threats that we're facing are really stable. We came across another report by National Academies of Sciences called Computers at Risk, the National Research Council, 1991, and it had an Annex E on the high-grade threat, where it talked about how you have some people that are advanced and they are patient and they will try and they know exactly what information they need and they try to get at it. And that's what we would now call, 20 years later, the advanced persistent threat. So we see a lot of these trends have stayed stable for 20 years, even 40 years.
But the marketing is now catching up.
Right. But I'm sure that's not really true, Dmitri. I'm sure there are, real trends that we've been seeing, not just at the level of the surface of the ocean, where you see the waves and the waves seem different every day, but really fundamentally different. Can you kind of walk us through? You're at CrowdStrike, one of the companies that's really in the forefront of dealing with these. I saw you were one of the 7 companies that NSA has said are certified incident responders. So what are you really starting to see in the front lines?
Well, I think you're right, and your book really highlighted that the more things change, the more they stay the same. And everything that we have seen now has been thought of 40, 50 years ago. And I think it's about time that we actually debunk some of those misconceptions that have been so pervasive in the industry. So I get really tired of hearing policymakers and others talk about the difficulties of attribution. And your book highlighted this, that one of the
book
first
was called A Fierce Domain, $9.99 on Amazon.
and I'm not getting royalties from this, by the way. But one of the first cases, big cyber cases that we can think of was Cuckoo's Egg, a fantastic book by another book, but by Cliff Knoll, an astronomer at Berkeley Labs, that detected an intruder. He wasn't a cybersecurity expert at that time. There was not even a professional like this. Detected an intruder. No one wanted to pay attention to him. In fact, for about a year, he's been calling up all kinds of people in the government because the intruders were hitting Berkeley Labs and then piggybacking off of that network to go after military networks, including NSA and some others, and no one would pay attention to this, right? And he single-handedly started tracing it. At the time, it was phone lines, it was dial-up, and they were jumping off from one phone provider to another and going across the Atlantic, so it was really, really hard to do, and yet he was able to track it down to 2 individuals in Hamburg, Germany, who were actually working on behalf of the KGB to try to break into the Star Wars program back in the 1980s. That was 30 years ago.
Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, not the movie.
Although they may have wanted that too. Exactly. But 30 years ago, an astronomer with no expert in cybersecurity, no sophisticated tools, was able to attribute a nation-state adversary threat that was going after significant national security secrets. And it occurred to me that if you actually look through most of the big events, major events that we have seen in this field, they've all been attributed. Not all of that information may have come out publicly. Some of it may be classified. But I can't think of
even espionage.
Even espionage. Now, there's degrees of attribution, right? Some people say, well, we don't know who ordered it. But that's true in the physical world, right? We had a case, you folks may remember a few years ago when the Justice Department indicted a person who was working on behalf of the Iranians to try to blow up a Saudi ambassador here in Georgetown. We still don't know to this day, presumably, whether it was the Ayatollah who was ordering the hit or whether it was a rogue agent in the RGC, right? We have those difficulties in any domain. We don't know who's giving the order. We may know who's executing it. Same thing in cyberspace. We know it's a PLA officer. Do we know if it was President Xi that ordered it, or if it was him working with a state-owned enterprise, sort of moonlighting on the side? We may not know that. And intelligence may never be that precise. But in terms of knowing where it came from and what they wanted, we're actually very, very good at that.
Yeah. And frankly, as a policy perspective, why do we even care, right? We know this was a PLA unit. We don't have to be the ones to prove, and we can just presumptively hold
that's right.
a head of government responsible for what happens in his government.
And that's exactly what we did with the Iranians, right? We held them responsible regardless of whether it was a rogue unit or not. So people get so hung up on how detailed is our attribution, but our attribution is actually pretty good. The other thing that, just as a side note, that really annoys me is that phrase that cyber moves at a speed of light, that we absolutely need a machine involved. That's such nonsense. Yes, you can push a command, and if you've got a fiber optic cable, it can be transmitted to another system at a speed of light. But the equivalent of that is saying that kinetic warfare moves at a speed of sound because that's how fast a bullet is flying. So clearly we can't have humans involved in kinetic warfare because it's moving too fast, right? No, it's nonsense. In fact, cyber operations actually take years to plan out, right? If you're going after a hard target, the reconnaissance you have to do to execute that operation, once you get in, figuring out where you need to go, how to actually take destructive or disruptive actions in cyberspace is really, really hard and takes months, if not years, of preparation. So the idea that it moves at the speed of light is just complete nonsense. You have years of work, and then, yes, you push a button and it moves at the speed of light, but that preparation takes a very long time, just like the moment that you push the trigger and the bullet comes out, yes, it's flying at the speed of sound, but there's a lot of tactics and strategy that goes into it.
I presume there are some aspects of defense you wouldn't mind automating.
Absolutely, absolutely. Just like you'd want a Kevlar vest to protect yourself against that bullet because you may not be able to move away from it. But it doesn't mean that strategy, tactics, human beings being in the loop are not critical either in the kinetic warfare or in cyberspace.
I think machine to machine, I think about information sharing and threat sharing sort of, without a human slowing that transaction down.
Yeah, but I think, and I presume we'll get to information sharing, what to do with that information still requires a human being to understand the context, understand the responsive measures that are taking place. Just because you get an IP address from someplace yes, you may want to block it, but that's not necessarily going to stop the threat if it's a persistent threat. You really want to understand the context. What are they going after? What else they may do? And that involves a human being.
Yeah, it seems like the headlines are dominated a lot by the data breaches. It seems at the deep level here in DC, we're worried about the espionage, but what's taking up a lot of the oxygen is the data breaches. And maybe Dmitri, and then go to Tom, and you just want to maybe talk a little about, or maybe Tom, you want to?
Sure. I guess I would say, you have to talk about the breach du jour, the JP Morgan breach. And Dmitri and I were just talking before we came in. I was saying that, my heart goes out to JP Morgan. They're probably the best of the best out there. They devote tremendous resources to this problem, and there is no lack of will or determination on their part. But they have a global architecture, with tremendous surface area that's open to attack. And it's a variation on the Willie Sutton rule. That's where the money is, and so they're going to get hammered all day long because there's that tremendous incentive that's never going to go away to get in those banks. And so I think it's inevitable that there's going to be some point at which some employee in their gigantic corporation makes a mistake and clicks on something or does something that's less than perfect. And that's the heart of it. They have to get it right 100% of the time, and the attackers have to be right only once to get in there and have a chance of getting something.
Yeah.
But I would just add that we talk about data breaches. We've talked about data breaches in the 2000s. We've talked about data breaches in the 1990s. And the irony, again, going back to the theme that we were just talking about, is that we've been worried about destructive attacks, the Cyber 9/11, Cyber Pearl Harbor now for, I think, close to 25 years now. I think it was coined in 1991 initially in a congressional testimony. We haven't seen that. And I think we need to ask some hard questions of why is it? If it's so easy to do, someone surely out there would be doing this. And I think the answer is really it's not that easy. And we actually did a presentation at the RSA conference earlier this year where we looked at all the past attacks that have been sort of quote unquote destructive, right? And anything from Shamoon in the Middle East a couple of years ago to even the Chernobyl virus. Some of you may recall that back in the mid-90s that was pretty disruptive. And everything except for Stuxnet, which was an outlier, was actually disruptive, not destructive. All of these things have actually, the only thing they've done is actually destroy data, which is not typically permanent destructive attack, right? If you have backups, you can restore that, you can be up and running almost in no time, including Shamoon. A lot of things have been made about, a lot of concern has been raised about Shamoon. All it did is delete hard drives, right? Delete data on hard drives. It didn't permanently damage anything, and the companies that were hit were actually up and running very, very quickly. And we looked at what it would take to actually do physical destruction, and it's actually very, very hard with modern hardware. We've done some really cool stuff where we're able to get the temperature of the processor in the laptop to 100 degrees Celsius, boiling water temperature, but we couldn't quite set it on fire because there's a lot in modern electronics that actually prevents you from doing that. We actually managed to.
It's got a fun job. Yeah.
It was a pretty costly experiment, actually. We went through a lot of machines to pull off that demo because we wanted to do it live on stage, and you want to make sure it's perfect, and you go through a lot of iterations before it is. Trust me on that one. But we were able to permanently brick that machine, would completely destroy it. It wouldn't boot the video. It wouldn't come offline. So you could do that. But even that is very, very specific to a particular model of machine, pretty difficult to do. So some of these things are a lot more sophisticated than people give it credit for.
And one of the rules that we found is that, or that seems to be true so far, is in the internet, it's really easy to take something down. It's very difficult to try and keep it down over time. So I'm really curious. I mean, so if
Can I comment on the destructive attacks?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
I think I would certainly agree that it's not easy, and that the capability to do a significant disruptive attack, particularly against large swaths of critical infrastructure, is very difficult. But I would say not impossible for a couple of key players. And the question is, well, why haven't they done it? And I would say that they could do it if they spent the time preparing for it. It's just that deterrence still applies, even in cyberspace, and that the U.S., for example, has made very clear that we reserve the right to respond in other domains. If a destructive attack were to cause massive damage to our economy or even cost U.S. lives. But I would also say that deterrence could break down. If we ended up in a conflict with some countries, say China, for example, I could see them suddenly having a very large motive to do destructive attacks in the U.S. And I would say we're probably not ready for that.
And I would add that it goes back to attribution. Those players probably feel that attribution is good enough where they would be discovered and attributed, and that's why.
And maybe the point at that point would be to be attributed, in terms of sending signals in the escalation of a crisis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was interesting because I think there's a lot of good points in there. There's the Pearl Harbor that I want to come back to, the JP Morgan that I want to come back to, the attrition. I think I'll start on the JP Morgan. The first is I want to talk about presumption of breach, and then I want to talk about Russia. And one of the things that strikes me about JP Morgan is that they hired a new chief information security officer that was one of the pioneers or was an early adopter of the phrase presumption of breach, that you assume that the bad guy's in your network. Right? If you
we have to do full disclosure, right?
Full disclosure. He's one of my senior fellows in the program, Greg Rattray. But if you have a great mansion and you assume that there's a burglar, there is a really talented ninja hiding somewhere in your mansion, how would you go about finding the ninja, who is very adept at being silent and invisible? And so JP Morgan hired this guy that brought in a team around him that used this methodology, and a couple of weeks later, what do you know? They found someone. So I actually see this as potentially, I think this is the story, but I don't know this is the story, that it wasn't necessarily technology that found this. It's not too bad JP Morgan, but they said, let's go ahead and definitely start looking for someone. They definitely found him, not with technology, but with a doctrine, with tactics, techniques, and procedures that say, here's how you would spot someone, and they went and spotted them, which might mean that this is widespread, and it's only the people that are good at looking that find. Any reaction?
Well, can't comment specifically on that institution, but it's funny because back in 2011, 3.5 years ago, I did a Shady Rat report where I sort of coined the phrase that there are two types of companies. Those that know they've been breached and those that don't yet know it. Since then, it's been used by everyone without any attribution to me.
Attribution is difficult.
I had General Alexander once tell me who's been using that extensively. I told him, General, I used it first, and he said, well, I thought of it first. Yeah. So make sure you trademark your phrases if you want to make sure that they don't get stolen. I started in 60 Minutes with Director Comey now. But I think that's the reality. At the time, people were up in arms saying, how can you say that? That's ridiculous. You can't say that everyone's breached. But the reality is they are breached. And most of the time, they don't even know it. And oftentimes, the adversary is in their networks for years before they're discovered. And once you start looking, you can actually uncover a lot.
Yeah. We can't be breached. I bought a firewall. Right. And I also want to come back to this. First, when we heard about JP Morgan, it was all Russia in the headlines, like this was Russia. And in general, you can kind of point to a country being responsible because you know what they do. You know how they operate, and you've got a large footprint, and Dmitri has been involved in doing this. Or two, you look at the artifacts that they've left in the computers, and you can spot this. This was compiled with a Russian language, with a Cyrillic keyboard, and you've got these other real technical clues in there that lead you to the attack. Or context, right? As soon as people figured out what Stuxnet was, they said, oh, this is going after Natanz. I bet this was Israel or the United States. Or look at what's happening to Estonia. We probably can guess this is the Kremlin. And you can figure it out from the geopolitical context. In JP Morgan, it seemed like it was all the context. Well, we just had these sanctions on Russia, so maybe this was Russia. That lasted for maybe a month, and then I just heard there was the report coming out that the FBI doesn't think it's Russia anymore. So how do we get ourselves into this, where we get this meme going on that it's one country, and then
the amount of bad media reporting that I've seen on that specific case, I think exceeds anything I've seen in years. And it's a broader challenge that we have with these types of stories. The people that know can't talk about it because they're under non-disclosure agreements or the information may be classified and they're not at liberty to say. So the only people that are commenting on it are people that are far removed from the investigation, maybe overheard something that out of context, and that's what gets out in the press. So I was really glad when Joe Demarest from the FBI, the director of Cyber Division, came out and said, we don't know. and it's likely not nation state, I think, is what he actually said. So I think there was a lot of jumping to conclusions there that occurred very, very rapidly in the media. There were actually some good reporters that were pushing back on it, but unfortunately a couple of major news media institutions jumped on that story, and everyone else followed.
Yeah, and that's one reason I'm glad that there's a lot of specialty cybersecurity folks now that are in the business and increasingly in the room that have at least enough background to dive into this. But I mean, I think J.P. Morgan could have done a little better on that to get ahead of it too.
Well, I mean, now the information has come out. I think J.P. Morgan released it that the only thing that was stolen was names and addresses of people who are their customers. Okay, Putin is really, really interested in the 70 million people that are J.P. Morgan customers, right? I mean, it's a bit nonsensical because none of the password information, according to J.P. Morgan, or account data was compromised.
Yep. And on attribution, Tom, I'm curious. I mean, we were always told this is tough. Just today, the Joint Chiefs of Staff or the Joint Staff put out a Joint Pub 212 on cyberspace operations, where they said attribution is figuring out the cyber persona and then getting back to some organization in order to hold them responsible. And I thought that was an important phrase. When you're getting briefed or the feeling of the committee, Dmitri was saying we've done a great job of getting past attribution being a problem. Is that the sense that you're getting there? What standard is really important when you're dealing with elected officials?
I'm not ready to say attribution is easy, and particularly when the data ledger that attribution is classified, then it's complicated. Or even if it's not classified, maybe it's proprietary. And so even if you have a pretty solid case on who you think did it, it's often difficult. And think about how long it took for folks to talk openly about the Chinese cyber espionage campaign. Those first public comments about sort of naming China were years behind the fact this entire town knew China was doing it, but nobody would say it publicly. There's a lot of reasons for that. But
Angela Merkel told Hu Jintao in 2007, right? Stay out of my laptops. Laptop, something like that.
Yeah.
Not the phone.
Yeah, right. I was waiting for that. I'm hopeful that on attribution, that having gone through the Crimea crisis, that we can do better on this. Sakyr, the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, the top NATO general, said, Mr. Putin, we're not going to get fooled. We've got these little green men that don't have patches, but they're carrying Spetsnaz weapons, and they're hanging around Crimea. We don't believe your denials that you don't have some hand in this. And that same kind of mental process, the same analysis that you would go through to say we're not going to get fooled by little green men, is actually not very different, I think, than the process that you go through by saying, or frankly that they did for Stuxnet, to say this was probably Iran or China, or that you might be able to do for Estonia.
The one thing that has changed recently, I would say, in response to the public attribution that's been put out on China and Russia and other places, is I've noticed a really change in their behavior in the sense that they stopped caring about attribution. And I think the only people that still care about attribution is really the West at this point.
Say that again. So the Russians
I believe that the Russians and Chinese no longer care about being attributed to the attacks that they're doing now.
They're increasingly, even on the espionage side.
Especially on the espionage side.
No kidding.
I'll give you an example. We released publicly a report on an actor we call Energetic Bear, which is a Russian nation-state sponsored attack from the Russian intelligence services that's engaged in espionage activities primarily in the energy sector, oil and gas, and other related interests of Russia, which absolutely makes sense given that Russia is a petrostate, and that's a massive part of their budget. We released that report, we released a lot of the indicators of that report. So what would typically happen, if this was the NSA that was attributed that way, all of that infrastructure would be immediately burned. They would start from scratch because they don't want to engage in any more operations that would be attributed to them. You know what the Russians did? They continued on. We're still seeing attacks from them using the same TTPs that have been publicly published, so you know when you detected that it is Russia. There's no question about it. They just don't care. The Chinese, I think, made a strategic decision that all of our public diplomacy and the news reports that we're making about attribution and some of the very good attribution that the Justice Department did with the 5 individuals that they indicted, that we did at CrowdStrike when we unveiled the 12th Bureau of the 3rd PLA in the building that they were in. They just decided that that's cost of doing business, that there's beyond the bad PR, there's no impact, and the value of what they're able to steal is enormous, and they're going to continue doing that. So that has remained unabated even when these individuals are outed. The information about those individuals goes down, their social networking profiles disappear, but the operations continue, and without virtually any changes. So I think they've just realized that, is there really a downside to being attributed? In the case of Russia, when you've got troops in Ukraine, do you really care about being attributed to some cyber attacks?
Yeah. It seems the administration is starting to go on, well, I thought it might be a new defense or a new strategy with the indictments. It doesn't seem to much have happened. I'm curious, Tom, when did you guys know, well, I don't know if you're going to be able to answer. I'd love to know if you guys knew the indictments or you're seeing, what are you hearing? Do you think that's going to be a useful way to proceed down?
I forgot to add a caveat that I'm supposed to add every time I talk publicly, that the views I express today are my own and don't represent necessarily those of the committee. Right. So with that said, I think a number of folks, including Chairman Rogers, have pushed for a much more energetic campaign against the Chinese, because I think you're almost certainly going to have to turn up the heat a lot higher to change their calculus. And based on the behavior of the Chinese today, I would say we have not reached that point yet. That said, it's a good thing to basically, to create some accountability for stuff. Whether they were moonlighting or working on behalf of the Chinese government, what they're doing is wrong. It's outside the norm of the way nation states treat each other. Going back to like the dawn of man, espionage between states to discover plans and intentions and capabilities is fair game, but stealing trade secrets so that their companies compete against ours in the international market, that's not fair game. And so, and we have to sort of maintain that line to tell them over and over again. And we have to keep saying it in every conversation. And I look back at some of the things we've done in China in terms of human rights. We have gotten something back from all the effort we've, certainly, China is not a human rights paradise right now, far from it, but we have gotten folks freed and things by engaging the Chinese and talking to them, in some cases embarrassing them by talking to them about it. So I would say I'm not ready to give up in this process. I would just say we're not there yet in terms of what we have to do to turn that temperature up.
It really struck me a couple of years ago. I was at an event, and there were people that dealt with China on non-proliferation issues. And they said, boy, we've had a great couple of years talking to them. They don't do everything, but it's better. We have a conversation. Sometimes they help on these issues, but not these issues. Sometimes it helps if we go quiet. Sometimes it helps if we go loud. And then, that was interesting. I didn't know that. And then the people that deal with China on cyber got up and said, well, we haven't yet engaged with China on the issue. Now that was like maybe 3 years ago. But it was this real mismatch of, and so it'll be interesting, hopefully, as we get along.
But it probably took us a couple of decades on the non-proliferation side to get to that point, right?
Maybe a decade.
I think it is a long game, and we just started making that case publicly, as Tom said, only a couple of years ago, and it's no wonder we're not yet seeing any results from that. And I think even if you look at the indictments, there's a lot more we can do, right? We named 5 individuals. We did not name the state-owned enterprises that were benefiting from that information, even though we did pretty much everything but publicly name them, and I can publicly name them here based on our own information. It's BioSteel, they're a huge steel manufacturer that's breaking into U.S. Steel. It's Chinalco, they're a Chinese aluminum corporation that's breaking into Alcoa. Again, none of this should be a surprise, since they're state nuclear technology corporation that was breaking into Westinghouse to steal the information on the nuclear reactors, right? So those are massive companies with billions of dollars in revenue, global operations. If we indict those companies, that would be a major step and a significant escalation. Now, there will be blowback, right? And they'll certainly take other actions against us in the trade arena. But I think that's the way we need to start thinking about this issue. I think we made a strategic mistake by saying this is a cyber problem. I don't believe it's a cyber problem. I believe it's an economic trade policy problem, because what they're doing is essentially benefiting their economy by competing unfairly in the global marketplace, stealing our intellectual property. And by the way, they're doing a lot of other things in that same vein. Not using cyber, they're manipulating their currency, they're bribing people all over the world, they're engaging in a variety of practices that we find objectionable and violating, if not the letter of the law, it's at least the principles of WTO. So that's the issue that we need to be raising with them. and start thinking about sanctions against particular companies, particular sectors, to really start impacting their bottom line.
And I would add, too, that there are a number of members of Congress that want to do something on this. Chairman Rogers has a bill to basically go after, visas for folks coming to the U.S., go after financial assets, and a number of members are looking at changing the law to provide bigger sticks to go after, especially in the cases where, we see a Chinese state-owned company that's productizing something they stole from a U.S. company. That's something we should probably go after.
And I like that because it takes it away, and you mentioned this, Dmitri. If we just say there's a cyber thing, then we're setting ourselves up for this equivalency discussion. Well, NSA does X, Y, and Z, which it's not unfair, but we can take that more off the table by saying, no, this is about economic copying and stealing, as you suggested. I like that.
And we have...
And after this, let's be ready for the microphones. We can start taking some questions.
And we have seen cases of human spies, right, that have been embedded in companies, that have stolen data, that we've arrested. So that needs to be part of the broader discussion. It's not just cyber intrusions that are taking place. I'm curious, Tom, one of the things I have not seen much is engagement from Treasury and Commerce on these issues. It seems like it's typically the DoD that's beating the drum in the intelligence community about these issues. But it seems to me if this is really a trade issue, we should be thinking about it from a Commerce Treasury perspective. Have you seen that?
I mean, I think Chairman Rogers would like it to be the first talking point in every conversation we have with the Chinese until it stops.
Yeah, great. I've got other questions, but I wanted to take a pause and just see if we had any coming in from the floor. If not, I will continue to pile in. All right, I'll keep an eye, in the front. Wait for the microphone, please. And remember, during the questions and answer, we will do the answers, but please make sure that you ask a question.
Hi, my name is Carl Grindle, Cyber Conflict Studies Association. You were talking about the norms of industrial espionage being supported by state-sponsored espionage, entities. Is that really a global norm when the United States has committed to that policy, but we have allies that have not? If you look at France, that's still permissible. Should we not be starting with our allies before we move to neutral or foes in expecting that same, level of commitment to an international norm?
I mean, I would say just on a matter of scale, I don't think there's anybody that compares to what the Chinese are doing right now in terms of volume and the boldness. I would say it's probably not the first instance of, state-sponsored cyber espionage or economic espionage in the world, but nobody's done anything on this scale that I'm aware of.
But I think you raise a very good point that I think we're actually the only ones that I'm aware of, including some of the closest allies we have, like the Brits, for example. I don't think they have a direct policy to not engage in economic espionage for the benefits of their private sector. We're the only ones out there. So it is a US norm, it's not a global norm.
So I'm curious on we're talking about these norms. I don't want to let the point go past that some countries would be pointing the finger at the United States and saying, what are you guys doing? It seems like you guys were pretty bold with your own intelligence. There's been a lot out there for reform and transparency in this. And Tom, I was wondering if you can kind of talk about what's the status of those efforts.
Yeah, I think there are concerns that it's going to be difficult to get an information sharing bill done until we pass something in terms of surveillance reform, and that's still an active debate that I'm probably not willing to wade into. But I think there's a lot of different ideas on the table. I think from Chairman Rogers' perspective, he is interested in additional transparency and sort of accountability in there, but there's a lot of other sort of pieces and sort of proposals on the table right now.
So, but probably not until next Congress for any
It's a great question. I think it's it's certainly possible, and we're certainly hopeful we can get something done in the lame duck session this year.
Okay. Good. We look forward to that. Okay, yeah, Tal?
Going back to the conversation about the indictments not really doing much and attribution not really doing much, should there be a conversation about offensive cyber operations happening in this country?
Thank you, Tal.
Yeah, it's right there on the banner. It's statecraft. I think there are certainly a lot of different pieces at play in this, and that nothing really happens in a vacuum. Cyber economic espionage doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's part of a larger sort of trade and economics argument that's going on. And so I think when it comes to responding to a threat, whether it's let's say, for example, Chinese economic espionage, I think it should be all tools on the table. Whether it's diplomacy, it's sanctions, it's indictments. Offense is probably a different kettle of fish, in terms of the response it will probably trigger. The term that my chairman uses a lot is, don't go and basically punch that guy in the nose until you've hit the gym and you're ready for the response that will inevitably come. And that if the U.S. attacks another country, it's almost certainly going to trigger a response that will come back not on the U.S. government, but on U.S. industry. And I think that's probably not a fair fight.
Yeah, I mean, and it's pretty escalatory, right, from the start of it, right?
So if all options are on the table, is the option of stealing data from them to give to our private sector also on the table?
The U.S. does not do that, and it's not on the table. No.
Yeah, but we hear that come up. We hear that come up a lot. And so
I would say also that it's a lot easier in places like China because they have state-owned enterprises that they can give the data to. Say for example, if the U.S. were to go out and do something like that, who would we give the data to? I mean, you're almost looking at antitrust problems in terms of how do you actually distribute this sensitive market data in a fair way?
Yeah, and I'd like to touch on this because it's a great question. Especially when we have a lot of this, if it comes down to punch the guy in the nose. I mean, it's you're hitting me, I'm going to hit you, and we have the slap fight until one of us falls down and can't take enough. But it doesn't have to be that raw, right? I mean, there's more subtle ways to do this. Dmitri?
Well, it's interesting to see how different nations look at cyber offensive capabilities. Not the espionage, right? Everyone does espionage, maybe for different purposes, but they all do it, at least the advanced nation states. But I think we actually look at the offensive side of the equation very differently from the Russians and the Chinese. And I actually tend to think that they probably have a better view of it. Our view is very military-centric. What can we do to enhance kinetic operations? Can we blow up that target through cyber? Can we disable their integrated air defense system? All those sorts of things in support of traditional military campaigns. The way the Russians and the Chinese primarily view it, and it's not to say that they don't have some capabilities that are similar to ours in that same realm, but if you look at all of their doctrines and public statements, even Putin just did a big speech on this very issue a few weeks ago, it's all focused on information dominance, right? So Putin is out there saying we're being attacked every day through cyberspace. And what he's talking about, if you actually look at the details, is, oh my God, the West is putting bad thoughts in our populations. They're spreading misinformation about how bad Russia is. That means we're being cyber attacked, right? And the Chinese, same thing. Oh my God, they're penetrating our Chinese firewall and telling people about 1989. That's a cyber attack, right? But the broader issue at hand here is that the way they look at cyber is ability to influence and engage in propaganda operations, disinformation operations. That's what they're afraid of. That's what they're focusing on from an offensive perspective. That's not what we're doing. In fact, we're traditionally very bad at doing these sorts of operations, cyber or otherwise. But I think it's actually pretty instrumental. You look at what's going on in Ukraine right now and the fact that there are probably thousands of Russian troops and tanks in Ukraine, and they've been able to achieve almost complete information blockout of that area. Certainly in Russian, most people don't even know that there's a war going on and that the Russian troops are fighting and dying in Ukraine. And they've been able to impact world opinion, little green man, not being able to tie that to the Russian military. That's how they think of being able to use cyber very effectively. And I think we're missing something by not focusing on that aspect of cyber.
I mean, it really strikes me back in the 90s when we started the doctrine on this. Just today we released this 3-12 on cyberspace operations. 16 years ago now, in 1998, we issued 313, Joint Pub 313, on information operations. And computer network attacks was listed in that, but it was just one of the many ways that we do information operations. And of course, especially in the 10 years, or in the years of General Alexander, right, we've pushed heavily on cyber. Information operations is secondary. It's kind of been banished to NDU and a few other places, but it's all about cyber, and it seems like Putin has never forgotten that it's about information operations. Okay, question back here, and then I'm curious to come back and to talk about some of the other countries, about Iran, North Korea, and some of the other threats.
Hi, my name is Xiang Li from Johns Hopkins Information Security Institute. So my question actually I think is for Tom and also I think for Dmitri. Recently, FBI Director Comey proposed some like change to the Congress, to change some act, some law, to basically to give the more kind of capability to the law enforcement, through, for example, the encryption backdoor, right? So I guess this is in the big picture of the capability the government want to have in terms of defense or offense, in this war. Any comment?
I'd say there are a lot of legislative proposals out there, everything from reform of surveillance to several law enforcement and also cybersecurity initiatives. I'd say probably most important from our perspective on the House Intelligence Committee is the information sharing bill to knock down the different barriers that are impeding information sharing between either the government and the private sector and between the private sector partners and back to the government again. And so I'd say that would be job number one for us in terms of legislation, and we're hoping to get that done in the near future.
This is another one of those issues that feels like such deja vu to me. We had the crypto wars in the 90s. I see Melanie Toplinsky in the audience, who's fought some of those wars back in the mid-90s, and it seems to be coming back again after 20 years. We should look at some of those arguments back then, and instead of trying to refight it anew.
So I wanted to come back and talk about some of the other countries. So I know, Dmitri, you're following a lot of countries, and we've talked about Russia and China. We've talked a little about the United States. What are some of the other countries that you're seeing most active?
Well, certainly Iran. We're increasingly worried that if the negotiations in November end in a stalemate or disintegrate, that they will go back to becoming more and more active. And they've gotten dramatically better in the last 4 or 5 years in this particular field, both defensively but primarily offensively. They spend an inordinate amount of time and attention and resources in building up cyber. It's a major focus for the Ayatollah, the president of the country, the Speaker of Parliament. They're involved in what they call a cyber council that meets regularly on these issues.
At that high a level?
At that high of a level. I can't think of any other country, right? The president has given, I think, 2 speeches on this total in his 6-year presidency, right? It's a big deal after Stuxnet, so not surprising. So they're not to be underestimated. They're getting better all the time, and definitely worry, particularly if the relationship goes south because of the negotiations. North Korea, they tend to reappear every couple of years and make sure that people still remember them, and this is one of the ways that they can stir things up. One of many, right? Occasionally they shoot some artillery at some islands, blow up a ship. Cyber is another one of those ways that they can do this, primarily targeted South Korea. So they did some things early on against the U.S., continental U.S., but in the last few years they focused primarily on South Korea or our forces, our military forces located on the peninsula. Those are kind of the 2 major actors, but we're seeing a lot more folks that are coming to the fore and getting attributed, really. So just earlier today, there was a presentation in Singapore, or Malaysia, excuse me, where one independent researcher actually outed the French and some of their capabilities in this space. So revealed a lot of their malware and operations that they're doing in this particular arena. We're seeing other countries, Western countries, like the Spanish, for example, have been attributed in the last few months as well. So everyone is doing it. The interesting thing is, though, that coming back to the original point, it's all espionage. Seen very little, no destructive activity really, and very little disruptive activity that's taking place. But I think General Hayden said that we're living in the golden age of signals intelligence because of cyber, and I agree with him. And in espionage, there's nothing like it.
Yeah. But it's interesting, Tom. So I mean, you've got a broad background, intelligence, military. You've really seen a lot. You talked about the deterrence seems to be working in this space, and I've been saying that myself. I think it's one of the most controversial things I say. That seems right. People are ready to have an argument about that. How long do you think? I mean, with this many groups getting involved, with this many countries, with so much happening and so many headlines, do you think that this balance of where we are not seeing these large-scale disruptive attacks, how long do you think we might be able to stay in this kind of sweet spot?
No, it's a great question.
I mean, and I think we're in a sweet spot, right? I mean, yes, the
Yeah.
espionage is bad, but nobody's died yet, and I actually think this is a very manageable problem compared to what it might be in 5 years.
Because over here you've got the more mature countries like the United States and China and Russia that have very exquisite capabilities, but they're very mature nations. They understand deterrence. They've lived in that environment for a long time, and so deterrence certainly applies. Over here are countries like Iran that I would say deterrence still applies, but their threshold is probably a lot lower. Take a look at the attempt to kill the Saudi ambassador here in Washington, or them feeding weapons to Shia militia that kill U.S. soldiers. So I'd say that their threshold for violence is much lower than other countries.
Maybe they have a better read on our responses.
Yeah. The two problems you have are deterrence can break down over here. If we were getting into a conflict with one of these countries, that deterrence, and we're already in a shooting war, the deterrence is suddenly not there. And maybe that's, a nice sort of steady step on the way to threatening nuclear, strikes as you escalate up that spectrum. Over here, if deterrence isn't working, maybe it's because they lack capability, and that certainly could change as these techniques and tools proliferate. Iran has surprised us all a couple of times, but not in the sense that they could probably bring down lights in a Western country, but that could change as time goes on.
And how much? Okay, if North Korea is out doing something, it's not like that's gonna drive any kind of huge debate in Congress. I mean, everybody knows North Korea is in the crazy bastard club, and we're used to that. But Iran is a central topic that's a central international affairs topic in Congress and around Washington, D.C. I mean, if they're developing this kind of capability, how do you think that changes our international affairs and the way that we talk about policy in this town regarding Iran?
I think, that would be a great decision, wouldn't it? If Iran actually crossed that line and conducted a destructive attack. There are press reports that suggest that those DDoS attacks into the banks were launched by the Iranian government. Apparently that wasn't enough, but it's not hard to imagine that if they launched an attack that actually did major damage to our economy or even cost lives, I think I would interpret that as an act of war myself.
Dmitri, we had seen this week Sandworm had come out. I'd only looked a little bit about it. It was kind of my students that were telling me about it because they'd been following the headlines. Can you talk us through a little bit?
Yeah, it's another Russian intelligence operation. We're actually tracking about half a dozen different groups within Russia, actors tied to different intelligence services, different parts of the Russian government that have particular mission priorities, right? So the energetic bear case that I talked about seems to be focused predominantly on the energy sector. There are other groups. That particular group was going after primarily NATO and information that are of interest to the strategic military component of the Russian forces. So you have a variety of different actors. There's one actor that we track that's focused very much on the Middle East and breaking into embassies in that particular region to collect intelligence. So it's not like what we may be doing from our intelligence collection perspective or allies, where you have specific organizations. NSA is doing this, CIA is doing that. And you have different actors that are providing different intelligence to policymakers on what may be happening.
Yeah. So I got two follow-up questions. One for you, Dmitri, but first I'd like to hear from Tom. I'm really curious. How do we know this is? When we say we know this is Russia, or how did you trace that back to China? I'd like to come back to that in a second. But so Tom, the chairman has come out and he said, we're not against spying per se, because of course we're out spying. The issue is the economic. So when we see these stories coming out for these Russian espionage cases coming in NATO, well, that's a very classic thing that is it's a real intelligence target. They're not stealing commercial secrets. They're stealing NATO secrets. That's what we would expect the Russians to do, and it seems within the rules of the game. Is it that way? When that comes across, does that go through the committee or through the staffers and say, "Grr," or is it kind of like, we got to do better on defense, and we've got to really try and do better on this?
Not commenting on any particular operation, but broadly, certainly we don't celebrate, our adversaries' espionage successes, and if they if they are able to collect intelligence, it's on us basically to improve our security and our counterintelligence.
How much, I mean, this has been going on since, like Dmitri kicked us off, since 1986 with the Cuckoo's Egg case in Cliff-Stall. Do you think, and we've been treating it like counter-espionage, and if you do counter-espionage, it's a wilderness of mirrors, never let, Tinker Tailor, never let the other guy know what the other side know what you know. But if they aren't even caring about getting caught in tradecraft, I mean, do you think that this counter-espionage, us treating it as counter-espionage, is still useful, that we're treating it as classified? I mean, if they're not even bothering to hide or change, then that seems like that should free up an amazing amount of countermeasures on our side that we don't have to really treat it. Why are we hiding it if they're not even hiding it anymore?
Yeah, I would say that it's not so much name and shame as it is, we should be redoubling our efforts and learning from these breaches when they happen. That's easier on U.S. government networks. When they're going after information in the private sector, it's a little harder, I think, sometimes to make sure that everybody's maintaining that high standard of security to basically beat these attacks.
Mm-hmm. But I'll give you one example that I think illustrates how overclassified things are. When we published our report based on our information and linked the 12th Bureau of the 3rd PLA and published a picture of the guy that was responsible for procuring the infrastructure, the building in Shanghai where that is the headquarters for that unit that was responsible for this, and all the evidence that we listed. I actually got a call from one government official saying, "You can't put this out. This may be classified." And I'm like, "No, it's not. It's our own information, right?" So the default is, oh my God, someone put out something that may resemble some classified information. But the reality is that all this information is out there. If the Russians are launching an attack on NATO, guess what? It's going over public internet networks. Security vendors and others may be able to identify it, may be able to attribute it. So the fact that we're keeping all this information close hold, thinking that no one else has it, is really a huge fallacy.
Yeah, I mean, the bad guys released it over the internet. The internet is public, right? I mean, you'd think by having their attack over the internet, and I'll come to the question in a sec. It reminded me when KL-007 got shot down by the Soviets. I'm sorry, let me say that actively. When the Soviets shot down KL-007, Reagan said, heck with sources and methods, we're going to release what happened. And Gene Kirkpatrick used at least the transcripts and maybe even the tapes of the Sukhoi pilot saying, I don't know, I see windows, it's not, it's not a rivet joint, to make the case. And he said, screw the source. I'm willing to lose the source, but we've got to show what's going on.
The Soviets probably had an inkling that we listened to their communication.
Right. I mean, Tom, do you ever imagine us getting, really getting to that place? And because when I see this in part of CISPA, the Information Sharing Act, of saying we need an act to get classified information better out to the private sector, I just don't understand why we can't just do that on the executive side. And why we need an act to do that.
The president under the Constitution controls that information, and so the president is probably best suited to make that cost-benefit analysis of when it's appropriate to endanger a source and a method, for a policy or a strategic goal. And so, in that case, the president decided he knew that there was going to be damage done by reminding, if they didn't already know, reminding the Russians that we were listening. But he decided it was more important to make that case to the world that this was not an accident. The Russians intentionally shot down a civilian airliner. In the case of CISPA, what we're chasing there is the fact that there are insufficient resources and authorities to basically provide clearances to folks that don't already have a contractual relationship with the U.S. government. So it's easy now, like a big defense contractor, they have a contractual relationship with the U.S. government, and there are clear authorities to basically grant them individual clearances and facility clearances to share information. But some rural electric provider that needs to know that there's basically an active attacker that's basically ready to put some damaging malware on their SCADA system, but we don't want that attacker to know that we're doing it. It would be nice to have a means to provide that to them or to their managed security provider and do that in a secure way so we're not tipping our hand to our enemies.
Are the classified signatures that much better?
So I would say there are many cases where the government has very useful information to provide, especially when it comes to nation-state actors or sort of very high-end criminal groups. But when you look at the totality of the bill, it's not just about that classified information.
Of course.
It's about trying to set up an ecosphere where we're getting that good information from the private sector. That's coming to the government. That's providing tips and leads to enable better collection to go overseas. And that sort of virtuous cycle goes around. And so not only does the classified information help in the first place, but it gets better over time as we're all talking to each other.
Yeah. And to your earlier point, I mean, if it's as bad as we're being told and as the executive branch is being told, I'm not sure why we're hearing the details from CrowdStrike and Mandiant. You know, I mean, we used to do the Soviet military power books. I always wondered why someone that's an original classification authority has such difficulty getting information out.
I would say to that, you know, when you look at a broad spectrum of attacks, there's lots of different ways to gather information and attribute it. So, you know, if a private sector company develops that information on their own with their own sources and methods, you're not necessarily endangering the government's means to collect that same information.
Yeah. Did you get in trouble? I mean, you said you get a call, but did you get?
It was really more of an education to that government official that no, we're not releasing any classified information. This was all developed through our sources and methods. And then I said, okay.
Great. Mr. Lightfoot.
And,
It's on.
my question to you is you talk about, I think it's very interesting, the notion that deterrence holds at a strategic level. So in a foreign policy conversation, Russia or China has not attacked the United States in a maybe strategically significant way. But if you are a CEO, that's great, but the cyber espionage stuff that falls below the threshold is strategically significant to you and your company. So how does this very sort of foreign policy conversation, but how does this, if you're a CEO of a company and you've been hit and it's not necessarily at a strategic level, what does this deterrence kind of conversation and concept mean for you as a business? What should you be expected to do and what should you expect your government to do to you when it doesn't rise to the level of strategically significant nationally, but very much is for your business?
I think that's a great question. I think what you need to figure out is what are the levers of power that you have, or with the help of the government or your industry sector, that you have on the adversary, right? At the end of the day, with economic espionage, yes, it may be the PLA that's doing it, but there's a state-owned enterprise or even a private sector enterprise working closely with the PLA that is receiving that information. And there's a lot you can do against that particular company. And there are some companies that are filing lawsuits against those companies. We'll see what comes out of that. Most of those lawsuits are in China, so I don't hold a lot of hopes for that, but they're trying to pressure Solar World, one of the companies that was actually named in the indictments as being a victim of the espionage from the PLA, is now trying to pressure the government to institute some trade sanctions against the solar providers from China that benefit from that information. That's one of the good ways that you can actually address the problem and create some deterrence, because if those companies cannot benefit from the information that they have stolen, right? If they can't market their goods to Western companies, then they're at a loss, right? There's only so many buyers of solar panels in China, and if the only outcome of their intellectual property theft is that they can build a product that they can sell in China, then at the end of the day, as unhappy as we are about it, we may just say, you know what, forget it, you know, knock yourself out, sell it to the Chinese market, but you won't be able to sell it anywhere else, right? And that's a win.
And I would agree that I would just add that when I was talking about deterrence, I was talking about for destructive attacks, that act of war, you know, but I'm not dismissing the threat, the damage that economic espionage is causing, but do we want to escalate, you know, that disagreement up into the conflict of actually kinetic attacks? I'd say probably not.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean we shouldn't respond very strongly and raise that cost. I would say certainly we should do that, but.
And I think therefore, if I can jump in as moderator, a lot of times if you hear the real technical people, they will say, well, if they're in your systems, then they are one press of the delete key away from making this a really dangerous attack and taking you down. And that is technically true, but especially if you're pretty sure it's a nation-state espionage that's behind this, the number of cases where that's happened is, I mean, it's happened, like maybe Saudi Aramco or Razgas, where that's happened, where it seems the Iranians weren't just looking at the computers, but they took them down. But I think it's a thin set of examples where a nation state has really gone into a company and done a truly destructive attack because they're worried about the consequences. Would you support on that?
Yeah, absolutely. You look at the history of disruptive attacks. That was a disruptive attack, not a destructive attack. Very few and far between, and the number of destructive attacks is nearly zero.
Yeah, and one of the things that we've really been worrying about also, and Jeff's question made me think about this, we were worrying from the early days in the 90s of, well, what if someone doesn't just destroy, what if they change the information? And Jane Lute puts it as, I don't really mind if someone can see my blood type. I care very deeply if someone changes my blood type in a medical record. And so in the 90s, we were worried, well, what if we end up sending, the DoD is getting rid of flow forces into the Pacific and we end up sending beams instead of bullets. But I still haven't really seen a big manipulative attack where someone goes into the databases and they really change what they find there in a really significant way. Am I right or am I wrong on that?
My scenario would more like be the financial services sector, where if
Right,
somebody
sure.
flips a few ones and zeros, that could cause absolute chaos.
Yeah.
And I think this comes back to our earlier discussion about deterrence. I think there aren't many countries that can actually pull off some of these attacks to actually cause massive disruption. I'm not talking about a bank or a utility, like the entire Northeast or the entirety of the country. That's a massive effort. It would take probably years of effort to actually lay the groundwork for that. Yeah. And there's a danger that they might be detected in that process. So they have to understand the risks before they even set out on that venture. And I think they know very well there'd probably be consequences. At least they fear there would be consequences of doing such a thing.
I would say that the example you mentioned, I think, is probably the most effective use of cyber. In fact, if you look at Stuxnet, technically it was that attack. The purpose of Stuxnet was not to destroy those centrifuges, to spin them up very fast and then spin them down very quickly to make the Iranians think that they're not functioning properly, and the Iranians are the ones that destroy them, not the Stuxnet itself. But the problem is that there's a limited effect to that. So once you discover it, right, the Iranians, once Stuxnet became publicly known, stopped throwing out perfectly good centrifuges, and now they have more centrifuges than they've ever had and more enriched uranium. So at some point when the victim realizes they've been played, they stop paying attention.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So I'd like to jump in and start looking at the trends. I mean, we talked a little about the history. We talked a little bit about the current trends. We said 2014, wow, that was the year of the data breach. And then we hit 2015. And what do you know? We're going to now have the year of the data breach again. It's like we're running the Olympics every year on this. And Tom, you led us off with in talking about data breaches. What do you think is in store for us in 2015?
Certainly more tanks. Willie Sutton's rule still applies. The money's still there. There's still a tremendous motive on the part of a lot of folks to get that money, and so they're not going to stop attacking. That said, I think the JP Morgan attack has sort of been, even more incentive to folks that were already very motivated to add more resources to this effort. I think we discovered the hard way that our point-of-sale systems were vulnerable, and the industry is not sitting still. They're responding to that in several interesting ways. That said, though, I don't think any of that's going to immunize us from further attacks this year. It's a fact of life that I think we have to get used to.
Do you think anything else might come out in 2015 other than data breaches?
I did not bring my crystal ball today, but I think certainly, from our perspective, I keep coming back to information sharing, but are we going to get something done this year? In the absence of legislation, industry is not standing still. They're out there building some important relationships. The financial services, ISAC, announced recently that they're building out a new mechanism for sharing information, and I think folks recognize the value of this. I see a lot of companies and services firms building out cyber intelligence efforts, and so I think a lot of that is already well and trained, but I think a lot of it's going to mature in the coming year. I think it could produce some impressive results.
Will we have an information bill next year?
I hope we'll have one this year, actually. But
do you think it's possible in lame duck that will?
I think it's certainly possible.
Mm-hmm.
And I will go out on the limb and say that there will not be a cyber Pearl Harbor next year.
Yeah. But I'd like to stay on this. Because sometimes, especially if you meet some of the entrenched Intel bureaucrats, I mean, they feel that is inherently a state activity. And it's really not something that amateurs are going to get involved in. If you've got amateurs, meaning non-states getting involved, they might spill sources and methods. They might be running to go public on something that means that we've now blown some of the ways that we would collect on this. In general, as you've been talking to people in the community, either members or others, is this town generally supportive of saying, we really do like it when we have these commercial intelligence operations getting set up? Or are you finding them conflicted?
I don't see a conflict on information. I think we want private sector entities sharing information, and the extent that we can build out better mechanisms to share it more efficiently, I think that's unquestionably a good thing.
And collecting information and collecting intelligence?
As long as they're doing it either within their own networks or, with consent, and I think, you can learn a lot by basically monitoring your own networks or basically going out with consent and sort of talking to compromised folks whose infrastructure is being used for attacks.
Yeah.
But the question is, when is it okay for a private sector entity to go outside their own network without consent? And so that's when it gets really dicey, I would say.
But there's other ways to get intelligence, right? I mean, you don't have to, you can be outside your own network by just sending someone to a bar and reporting what they overhear, classic human.
Doing a Google search.
Yeah, right. So, I'm really curious, if you don't mind, if I can hold off on the question of your crystal ball and what you see, how, if I can come back to the question, how did you know that this was the Chinese? In these, what kind of things make you so confident that when you say energetic bear, the bear is saying that you know this to be a Russian group? How do you go down that?
It's a totality of evidence. Sometimes you can be very specific. So with the 12th Bureau, we actually laid out the PLA unit. We laid out the entire evidence chain where we had identified the guy that was registering the domains. That guy was not announcing that he was a member of the PLA, but he posted pictures on his social networking profile. He was a photography aficionado, and he had a picture of his dormitory, and in the corner, it was very hard to see. We blew up the image. You could see the PLA hat, right? So we were like, okay, we're onto something, right? We started looking at other pictures. He had a picture of his office, which is this nondescript building. We didn't know where, but we saw the Pearl Tower in Shanghai in the background, so we immediately knew, okay, it's in Shanghai. Started looking at the building. The building looked really interesting. There was coating on the windows that were in this greenish color that's very indicative of protection against acoustic eavesdropping. So you know that this is a sensitive facility. You start looking at the surrounding area, and there's these massive satellite dishes. They're 5-6 meters in diameter, a little too big for TV reception, right? And then we said, okay, this is clearly a sensitive facility. Where is it? We started looking at imagery analysis through Google Earth, identified that location in Shanghai, sent a New York Times reporter to that area, take a picture. It came back. It was
sent to New York. Oh my God.
They ended up doing a story on that, but a front page story. But the picture matched exactly to the pictures that this guy was taking on his social networking profile. And we started looking at the address, and boom, in the open source literature on a Chinese government website, it says, yes, this is the headquarters for this military unit, which maps to the 12th Bureau of the 3rd PLA, which is responsible for satellite signal intelligence collection, right? So, boom, you go from a couple of domains and a guy that you find that you don't know is related, you can build the entire chain with pretty, court admissible, really, evidence to show that this is indeed them. Now, not all the time will you get that level of attribution, or is it that easy? But in the case of energetic bear, it's a totality of evidence. One of the things that I've actually had people that do offensive information for a living tell me is the thing that really concerns them from an attribution perspective is they can hide a lot. What they can't hide is a target, right? And if there's only one country that's interested in that target, well, it's going to be pretty clear who's going to be going after that. So that context matters a lot, and other things like those types of details that I've just described help you be very confident that this is indeed. In the case of energetic bear is Russia. Can you get down to the specifics? Is it FSB, GRU, SVR? Sometimes we can. Sometimes it takes a long time. Right? This is an investigation. This is kind of old style, gumshoe type of investigation where you're looking at all the dots, and sometimes it may take you months, maybe even years, but eventually they'll make a mistake. The thing to realize about cyberspace, you're dealing with human beings, right? The attackers are human. Even if they're working for an intelligence agency, in fact, if you look at who's working for these intelligence agencies, either on our side or their side, it's 20-year-olds, right? They're just out of the military, that have social networking profiles, that make mistakes, that have bad OPSEC. I was looking at some of the information that's been coming out on Ukraine, not the cyber piece, but the Russian forces there. A lot of it is on social media because these young guys that they're sending in there, before they go in, they go on their Russian version of Facebook and say, hey, I'm about to be sent to Donetsk, right? These things happen when you're dealing with the young population that's now in the military and in these intelligence services that wants to share everything that they are doing because that's what they've been doing since they were 10 years old.
Wow. I mean, you think when you hear cyber intelligence, I mean, you imagine this really arcane science of ones and zeros and say this must be, you must have to be a real cyber ninja to be able to pull this off. But I mean, that's just classic intelligence analysis.
That's what Cliff Stoll was doing back in 1986. That's what we're doing now. We're looking at everything, right? The other point is we're looking at imagery analysis, satellite analysis, traditional open source research, Chinese linguists are looking at all this information. So you bring it all together and the dots start connecting.
Now, in Joint Pub 312, again, this joint staff document that came out really, I think just today, they said the point of attribution is to be able to figure out with enough specificity to hold the actor accountable. Responsible, I'm sorry, was the word they used. So you came out with this, and when you came down to here's this dude, here's this unit, was there any, did you see any response from
Well, the Chinese got very personal. They usually say, you know, we don't hack, hacking is illegal in China, the US is doing all the hacking. This is the first time I've ever seen them. The Chinese ambassador in the US was actually responding in a bunch of media, personally calling us out, saying that we are out to make money, that we're making this stuff up, and that was really interesting.
Well, the first half is true.
So we are a commercial business, but they, you know, they're starting to get a little bit allergic to all the releases, and you know, when Director Comey on 60 Minutes said, you know, the Chinese are like a drunk burglar, I'm sure they didn't appreciate that either.
Yeah, I mean, do you agree with that, with the drunken? So Comey was saying the Chinese are acting like drunken burglars in this field.
I think they're getting better. I think that characterization was certainly true even a year ago. And there are groups within China that are really, really bad. We were seeing one group that we attributed directly to PLA Navy that was actually trying to break into a lot of, you know, Western networks related to our, you know, Navy defense contractors. And they don't just target us. They don't just target Western Europe. They also target Russia. We actually saw them sending a spearfish to literally the info@fsb.ru address that's listed on the main page of the FSB. You're thinking, okay, are you really expecting to get anything out of that? So a lot of the units are very, very sloppy and have bad tradecraft, but there's some pretty good ones out there that are much harder to identify and attribute.
Yeah. Interesting. All right. Last question for me. I'm curious, Tom, on. So you've been in Congress for a bunch of years, and you didn't know this question was coming. So, but I'm really curious. I mean, so we've been spending a lot of time on information sharing as a bill. We've got. You talked about a couple other bills. What do you think about one about disclosures? And we've got, if you can kind of talk about the issue on disclosures, and what would you like to be seeing? I mean, Congress has such an important role in this, and if you had your druthers looking out, not just these bills, but 2 or 3 bills out, what do you think is really going to be giving us some bite to make a significant difference here?
You know, breach notification is not in our committee's jurisdiction, but there's a good discussion out there about, you know, most companies are faced with about 48 different standards, state by state in America. And I think some of them, depending on what the standard is, would probably be interested in harmonizing that standard as long as it's not a worse standard. You know, I think a lot of folks with the best of intentions assume that the best policy would be an absolute requirement that the minute a company's network is breached, that they have to notify their customers within, you know, minutes or hours. And the problem comes that even with some of the highest end, you know, companies out there that are doing their best, once they discover, you know, an unauthorized presence on their network, it often takes quite a while to figure out where they went, what data they got access to, and what they were able to exfiltrate. And so if you have a breach notification requirement that requires a company to come up every 5 minutes and say, hey, my network is breached and your PII, your personal information may or may not have been disclosed in that process. That's not a useful warning to people, and certainly folks would become numb to that pretty quickly. Yeah. In terms of, you know, what happens next, you know, it's, I'm pretty focused on that 5-meter target of getting an information sharing bill.
Okay, good.
And, you know, I think one of the many things that motivates a lot of members that support that bill is that it's difficult, even if you're in favor of a regulatory framework, of the government basically telling companies how to secure their networks, it's difficult for the government to basically, and the slow, ponderous way the government works, to come up with a standard that's going to endure. And it's not going to be sort of out of date 5 minutes after it's published or even before it's even published. And so I think a lot of the folks that support information sharing believe that to the extent that companies aren't doing everything they can, it's probably because they don't understand the threat or understand the very specific threat that they're faced with. And that once you show that to them, they're now very motivated to fix it, because you can exhort companies all day long do a better job of securing your network. But if they don't understand exactly what that $100,000 purchase or that $1 million purchase is going to get them, it's hard to settle their board, in this cost-constrained environment we're in now. But if you can tell them, hey, there's a Chinese hacker right now writing code that's going to go after that SCADA system in your factory, or that piece of infrastructure in your communications network, they're now very motivated to fix it. And so I think once we basically knock down the barriers to information sharing, and then they don't fix it, then I think we have a conversation about what is required to fix that market failure. Because if they don't fix it when they're told they have a problem, well, then that is a market failure. But I don't think we're there yet.
I would add on the breach notification, I absolutely agree with Tom that I think the consumer's already there, where every day they read, Target, Home Depot, JP Morgan, and there's already such a desensitization that has taken place to that effect. And one of the problems is that they're not being told what to do, or sometimes when they're told what to do, it's completely wrong. So it really highlighted for me when there was a disclosure of the breach at a contractor for DHS. It was during the clearance processing for the personnel for DHS, and they notified all the people involved that all of their background checks, which contain huge amount of PII information, your essentially entire history, life history, has been breached. And the public reporting suggested that this was Chinese nation-state espionage, and what it suggested to those people is that they should get credit monitoring. Really? If the Chinese stole this information, they're not out to steal your identity. They're out to target you for blackmail so that they can recruit you perhaps, or get you to reveal some sensitive information. So what you should be getting is not credit monitoring, but counterintelligence training, things to watch out for someone trying to recruit you, and that information was not getting out there.
Yeah, and I didn't want to let you off the hook on predictions for 2015. So if 2013 was year of the breach, 2014 is yet another year of the breach, what are we going to be talking about a year from now in next year's Cybersecurity Awareness Month?
If you look at the trends, you've got almost every major nation state that has been attributed and their operations compromised. The Russians, the Chinese, the French today, the Spanish a few months ago. Despite the Snowden, despite the Snowden disclosures, none of the information has actually come out, thankfully, about the details of what's going on. We hear that there's allegedly some malware on Angela Merkel's computer, but none of that, the details of what it looked like, how they got in, was publicized. I think that if you just look at the trends and the probabilities, the chances are that in the next year or so, that there will be a disclosure and an attribution to NSA. I think it's just inevitable with the odds that we have, with the amount of focus from different security vendors on these issues, the vigilance on the behalf of the companies. I think that that's coming, and they need to be prepared for that.
Okay. But I mean, we kind of had Flame, right? Or were those, you think this is going to be into a much deeper level?
I don't know that Flame, there have been allegations, but nothing that's been
so you mean a real, okay, good.
I think that probability is high there.
And I'd never heard, you'd said here are the Chinese companies that were involved with the PLA indictments. Can you say those companies? Because I'd never heard that before, and I really
Sure. It was actually, I think you follow me on Twitter. I tweeted it. It's BioSteel, it's Shinalco, and it's China National Nuclear Technology Corporation.
Okay, very cool. Okay. Thank you very much for joining us for Cyber Risk Wednesday. Next one is going to be on November 5th with Soren DeCaro, as I said, to talk NATO, and after that, December 10th. Both of those and December 10th at medical devices, 9 to 11 with some breakfast beforehand. Before we thank the panelists, I want to say you've seen us, we've been sipping out of these great Atlantic Council Cyber Statesman mugs, and both of these gentlemen are cyber statesmen, and we'll have some of these mugs for both of them to be able to take with them. So please give a hand to thank our panelists.